Our session today. The session title is Starting Young, Meeting the Needs of African American Children by Listening to Male Educators. Your presenters today will be myself, Dr. Bweikia Steen. I'm an associate professor at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia. And my research deals with looking at strategies that teachers can readily, easily implement into the early childhood classroom that promote social, emotional, and academic excellence during the early years. We also have Ricardo Neal, who will be joining us. He is the president and CEO of We Will All Rise, and he will tell us a little bit about himself. And then we have Kenvin Lacayo, who is a board member of We Will All Rise, and he will be sharing his experiences as a male of color working in early childhood education. So our objectives today, we will discuss the research related to the preschool to prison pipeline. We're going to discuss the role of male educators of color as one solution to countering the preschool to prison pipeline. And then we'll discuss the barriers and the strategies that can be used to recruit more males of color in early childhood education. So let's take a look at what research says about um, our children and the preschool to prison pipeline. So if you look at the slides, you'll see that our preschool enrollment, 41% of overall preschool enrollment is made up of comprised of white children, and 19% are comprised of Black children. However, the out of school suspensions for our Black children um, are 47% and 25% for white children. When we break this down according to gender, for male preschool enrollment, 81% are other, and 19% of male preschool enrollment are Black. But our out of school suspension, you see that 55% of other receive out of school suspension at the preschool age, while 45% of Black males receive out of school suspension. Let's look at female preschool. So for female preschoolers, we have 80% are other and 20% are Black. And if we look at the out of school suspension, 54% of um, Black female preschoolers receive out of school suspension, while 46% receive out of school suspension if they are female. So what this slide is telling us is that our students who are students of color, come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, are feeling isolated, they're feeling misunderstood, they're often treated as other, and then this leads to them dropping out mentally and physically. So mentally, research says that our young children of color drop out by the age of, by fourth grade or by the age of 9 years old. I always say in presentations that I have found in my own research that by first and second grade, our children of color are mentally dropping out. And then you see here that due to feeling isolated, misunderstood, or treating as other, this leads to lower graduation rates and higher dropout rates. So what this research, what we did and what we looked at was looking at the impact of male educators of color in early childhood education and seeing and looking at their impact on as one tool for countering the preschool to prison pipeline. So a little research related to male educators of color, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, fewer than 3% of preschool and kindergarten teachers are men, and this figure has not changed substantially in recent decades. So this is an issue. If we know that male educators, specifically male educators of color, do help to counter the preschool to prison pipeline, but only 3% are males, that is something that we need to look at in our field. And then research says that when young children do not have relationships with male teachers and caregivers, traditional gender stereotypes are reinforced, particularly as they relate to children's understanding of who is responsible for their growth and learning. So let's look at some barriers to men of color in early childhood education. The first one we see, like we've already talked about, educator preparation programs, also known as teacher prep programs, are not producing male teachers. Less than 2% of public school teachers are Black males, and fewer than that are Latino males. So the barriers to men of color entering into early childhood education are low wages. Historically, this is a woman's profession, early childhood education. The lack of exposure to early childhood, to the field, just the lack of exposure, not even knowing if that's even an option to enter into early childhood education, and not seeing a viable pathway in the sector.
Thank you, Dr. Steen. My name is Ricardo Neal, and I've spent the last several years designing programs for young men of color entering early childhood or think about a career in education overall. Dr. Steen spoke about the barriers earlier, and in terms of designing programs, some of the things that we look at or consider in terms of recruiting young men and encourage them to stay in the field. It's the modeling that the young men will provide, that that children get to experience a positive male role model, something that they tend not to experience in the classrooms and sometimes in the community at home, particularly around this particular component that we were referring to in terms of early childhood education. And so we get to create more young men in that space. In addition, thinking about a career pathway, the idea of introducing another option in terms of where young men can consider how to, how to see options beyond programs or career or jobs that are typically in front of them, and introduce them to something that's rewarding and beneficial, not only to themselves in terms of the wage that they'll earn, but also to the community and to the young people. And in fact, that there is a space for them to grow and excel in the work. In addition to that, we look at diversifying the field. What that does, it brings in new perspectives from the young men, and we consider that a value added. When you hear from Kenvin a little bit later, he'll talk about his role in the classroom and what he has learned both from parents and for children. But these are three critical areas that we think through when we are designing programs for young men of color in early childhood education.
And Mr. Neal, would you like to share, provide a little background information about yourself and your organization?
Sure. Thank you for that opportunity. Again, my name is Ricardo Neal. I am a social worker by training. I've spent the last 25 years in communities doing organizing and education reform. The last 9 years or so, I have been in K through 12 education and in the nonprofit arena. The last few years, I've been focusing on getting young men to and through college. We Will All Rise, my organization. We are now currently supporting 20 young men where we provide them financial support. Each young man receives up to $10,000 every year for 4 or 5 years to make sure that we remove the financial barrier. And in addition to that, we provide wraparound supports in terms of mentoring, making sure that the young men have access to the sort of resources that they need to navigate the higher ed world and to be successful. Prior to that, where I worked with Kenvin, develop and support your programs in bringing the young men in the classroom across the country and connecting them so that there's a system of support as they explore whether or not early childhood is a space for them to work and to excel.
Yeah, thank you for talking about your organization and the fabulous work that you're doing
Thank you.
for our men of color and our young men of color in exposing them um, to the early childhood field. So I have this comic here based on all the head tilts. Maybe I better explain this again. So what we wanted to do is really have a voice from the field, um, a male of color, a male from Mr. Neal's programs and organizations to talk about what does he see as the cause for the preschool to prison pipeline, and what is he seeing as the solutions. And Mr. Neal, would you like to introduce him?
Yeah, I have known Kenvin, for the last 3 years since 2017. Coming out of high school, participating in a program that I was part of for a long time in terms of recruiting and also helping to plan that program nationally. I also do that with quite a few other cities and thinking about what are the best options for them. I think Kenvin is phenomenal. I won't speak for him, but to me, Kenvin is an outstanding example of what happens when you pour into a young man and introduce them to something that they typically wouldn't necessarily consider as a pathway, and make sure that you respect their time, that for his talent that he's compensated. And Kenvin is one, but we could have had 10 other young men on the call who are in this. He's representing young men who are hard at work in the field. Kenvin, I'll turn it over to you to say more about your journey and your experience and where you're going.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. So as mentioned, my name is Kenvin Lacayo. I am 21 years old. I'm a young son of immigrants. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Straight out of high school, I got into education through the Leading Men Fellowship, and ever since then, I've been committed to making sure that education is more equitable and making sure that I service my community, my city, the people that I care for as best I can. It's my journey.
What did we'll have a few more questions for you, Kenvin. Dr. Steen, do you want me to go on to the capacity side, or do you want to push some questions to Kenvin now?
Let's ask our questions for Kenvin. So the first one is, Kenvin, what do you see as the causes for the preschool to prison pipeline?
That's a great question. So I think that first and foremost, I think it's important to not ignore the historical context that has created such a problem, and understanding the precursors that have led to this, and the years and years of inequity that have existed, not just in education, but in this country as a whole. I think that's where it begins and where the problem is still rooted, where for so long our babies, our young people, and just our people in general have been on the receiving end of and even blamed for a system that was almost entirely created by people who don't look like them or care to understand them and their communities, and really never have, and even until recently, there's still a lot of people who don't, and those who try to, and sometimes don't go about that in the best way. I think that the biggest issue is just students, their communities and families, and even their teachers not having a strong enough voice in the decisions being made in education, and in decisions being made broadly in all other sectors that affect them and their daily lives. When I first entered early childhood education, I was taught early that behavior is communication. And I think that that isn't exclusive to our 3 and 4 year olds. I think that a lot of times our older students and our families and their communities communicate in ways that quite frankly, our elected leaders, school leaders, and otherwise have ignored for far too long. And I think that that's where the issue is primarily rooted.
Yeah, thank you, Kenvin. So you talked about some of the causes for the preschool to prison pipeline. What do you see as a solution for the preschool to prison pipeline?
So I think that whenever you're trying to solve any issue, it makes sense to look back at the issue or what you think is causing that issue to try to fix it. And so I think that it goes back to what I was saying. I think that those closest to the pain, closest those who are being affected, have to be closest to the power. So once again, students, their families, their teachers, their community have to be at the forefront of the decisions being made. Those decisions can't be made for them, they have to be made with them, if you want to see education become better. And I don't mean in the way that I've seen so much during this pandemic, with surveys and things like that, going out to, I mean, even college students, about the things, and then it seems like the surveys were just completely thrown out and ignored. But I mean, having students, teachers, even out of school students, recent graduates, college students, parents, different community stakeholders in positions where they have an actual say, where they have a vote, where they can um, actually implement what they know and their experiences, in changing policy and changing the direction of education. So not just a seat, just not just a regular seat at the table, but a seat at the table where their voice is more than just respected, but also considered, and not just considered. I mean, like, it has to be the focal point around what we're doing moving forward always.
So it sounds like you're saying we need to make sure that we listen, ask first, listen intently to the students and the families that we're serving of color to figure out what do they need, what's working, what isn't working, and what do they think should be implemented to counter the preschool to prison pipeline.
100%.
Thank you. Mr. Neal.
Yeah, what have you seen as barriers to males of color enter an early childhood sector? Why did you enter? What was the barrier? Why would you not have entered this field?
So I think that, much like all the other men who I have met in this field, a lot of it was just exposure, as you said, as been mentioned throughout the presentation already. Just not knowing that this is a viable option, not knowing much about the field, not understanding the field, and not thinking that this was something that was for us. And just the narrative that surrounds education, and I mean, I like to say that familiarity breeds likeness. And I don't think that our young men of color, or even students of color at all, are familiar with or see educators of color much at all in school. So it's not something that they build a likeness to. So I think that that was the biggest barrier about it, just not understanding it or being exposed to it. Um, if it wasn't for the Leading Men Fellowship, I would have never considered a job in education, much less a career in education. And I also think that a big barrier, because there is so few educators of color, or male educators of color in the field. I think that another big barrier could be sort of feeling alone. And so I think that, like, sort of brotherhood that I found, and the support that I found, is super important if we want to see young men, or men of color period, enter the field and stay in the field, um, moving forward.
Great, Kendrin. If I want to continue staying in solutions for you, what do you see as some additional solutions for recruiting more young men in the early childhood sector?
So I think that you have to pull the from the individuals who have gone through it, who are already in the education field, and you have to get them to sort of speak to them, speak to young men as early as possible. I think that a lot of other career paths, law and engineering and all these other things are promoted heavily, but you don't hear the same when it comes to teaching or education, and especially not early childhood education. So I think that it needs to be uplifted heavily and early as possible, in order to be able to recruit more young men. The young men are out there. They're passionate, and they're loving individuals who would strive in a classroom, doing the things that we do, but they just don't know, and you can't do much if you don't know what's available for you.
I think you're right with that. And then finally, what do you see as a role of male educators? Not necessarily in the classroom right now, but you're definitely still in a school building. And tell me what you're seeing in terms of the role of male educator. You've been doing this for the last 3 years or so, so I'm sure that you have ideas, thoughts on that.
Man, I think that the role of male educators is huge. It's vital and vast. I think that we look at the data and we see our students doing better when they have male educators in the classroom, but I don't think that we really sit down and take a minute to sort of ask why are students doing so well when they're in there. And I think until you see it in action or experience it, you can't truly understand how many gaps our male educators are standing in when they enter our school buildings. Um, Not just from a personal experience, but from what I've heard from other young men of color, the amount of things that they do, the amount of roles that they take in these schools are amazing. But at the same time, we have to be very careful with how we go about having our young men or young educators take on those roles. Um, I've been a mentor. I've been essentially what some students have called me father, dad, uncle, things like that. We've taken on a role in our students' lives that much farther extends just an educator or just a teacher. Um, my students text me at any time talking about sports or what's going on at home or whatever the case is, whatever's on their mind, and it's at any time. It's after school hours. It's late, and we're there for them. I think that it's also really important to sort of pull from the communities and neighborhoods that we work in, because I've had the privilege of working in my neighborhood, and so I understand what my students are going through, and I understand their circumstances. And so for them to be able to see me, and for other individuals in the community to be able to see me as a pillar of hope, essentially, it's extremely powerful. And so I think that that's the role that educators face, and I think that it's extremely vital, not just for education, but for our country as a whole, to invest in making sure that that happens.
Great, thank you. Um, Switching gears, and we'll have more time for questions and discussion in a bit. But as Kenvin spoke about his experience and some of the things that he's seeing, what I like to tell folks when I travel the country and I'm in conversation in terms of what we've seen that works over the last 5 or 6 years or so in terms of engaging young men, is that the introduction to the sector, finding ways to make sure that young men learn about it. I often have the young men go back to the high schools and talk to younger students. It could be in 9th, 10th, or 11th or 12th grade, but go back often and have those conversations. In addition to that, to encourage school districts, I know that there's school districts in Philadelphia and in Baltimore and a few other places that are specifically through their CTE programs creating early childhood education pathways to make sure that there is a structure and a system for more young men to participate in that. The numbers are few, but the more early childhood education pathways that exist on the secondary level, and we're encouraging young men to consider that, then it begins to create a pipeline earlier on in terms of the work. And then, to continue investing in post-secondary training program models. And so that at the secondary level, you're introducing young men to the work, but there are programs emerging all over the country that are beginning to train young men either through apprenticeships or through various other initiatives to make sure that there's a pathway and then young folks are taking these things into considerations. This is a broader policy issue. We've tried to do this in terms of our work, but making sure that in the sector as a whole, not necessarily to attract more young men, it would help, but the sector does not necessarily respect or elevate the space in terms of how much we're paying our early childhood providers. When you're in school districts, you have certified teachers who are doing the work, but when you're getting into non-district programs, I don't think that there's enough respect for the incredible work our providers do and ensuring that they're compensated for their work. Additionally, it is critically important to create mentoring and relationship building experiences and opportunities for our young men. So you bring them out in the field. How do you make sure that they're connecting to other male educators, educators of color, or other folks who've been doing the work and can nurture them and encourage them to stay in the field? Another critically important piece is relationship with universities to understand schools of education. Those are traditional, very broad, but when you get down to the early education level, to think about ways for universities, particular schools of education, to attract and retain these young men, and so that they stick with it. Oftentimes, the training and retention that involves deeper community work, community-based organization, not only providers, but folks who could advocate that these programs have the investment that their needs. And we're beginning to see those things happen in various places across the country, but more needs to be done. When you look at the research, when we said there's only 3% or less in many jurisdictions of men of color in early ed, it tells us there's a long road ahead of us. But having conversations like these, it will be critical in the years ahead if we want to increase the numbers in that area. Dr. Steen.
Yeah, so, this was so powerful. And I just want to thank Kenvin for taking the time to actually come on here and share your experiences and your perceptions about what we can do in early childhood to counter the preschool to prison pipeline. As the research has shown, our young children of color are experiencing failure by 3 and 4 years old. And that is something that should not be happening. I'm sure we all here, all the participants here can remember attending preschool or kindergarten and enjoying those experiences and wanting to go to school. And so many of our children of color are crying and misbehaving and crying out in ways that is seen as the behavior problem, but really they're trying to tell us something. And so, like Kenvin said, if we just listen to them, ask our young students questions, ask them what's going on, if we provide the role models such as men of color into our schools, then we can provide that pillar of hope. And one way that Kenvin, I stole your term, the pillar of hope. That's our one way to counter the preschool to prison pipeline. Like Mr. Neal said, some strategies to recruiting men of color. Mentoring is extremely important to recruiting our men of color. They need to have mentorship, and that's one of the reasons why I was excited to partner with Mr. Neal at first at the Literacy Lab, and then now with We All Rise. We Will All Rise, excuse me. And then also, as in higher ed, we have to make sure that our curriculum is culturally responsive. that we have opportunities for mentorship even in higher education if we're recruiting from high school, these men of color. And we have to provide financial assistance so that we can get more men of color into our higher ed facilities, our educator preparation programs. So we have this final quote: children are the heartbeats of our future. We have a social and emotional responsibility to create systems and structures to ensure that our children have a fighting chance to maximize their capacity and their humanity. We'd like to thank you for joining our session and just want to see if anyone has any questions.
Dr. Steen, would you like me to allow everyone to unmute themselves to ask questions, or would you like them to type it into the chat box?
No, that'd be great if they could unmute.
Okay, I will enable that right now. Okay, you can unmute yourself if you have questions.
Okay, it looks like there aren't any questions. Do you see any in the chat?
I do not see any, no.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any questions, we do want to thank you for joining our session. If you have any questions later on or want to contact any of us, our emails are on the PowerPoint. And we look forward to continuing this conversation about how to recruit more men of color and listen to our men of color as one way to counter the preschool to prison pipeline. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.